Welcome to this week's episode of the CPG View, the number one CPG information source for global omni-channel leaders.
Michael, thank you so much for joining this week's episode of the CPG View. As we were just talking before recording, you and I do have a lot in common, including the proximity to where we live and probably some of maybe our past potential career paths. But before we dive in, would you mind introducing yourself and the company you're with?
Sure. Michael Lockyer. I'm the Vice President of Brand Development at IGA, the Independent Grocers Alliance. And if you're not familiar with IGA, or those listeners that may not be familiar, we're the largest network of independently owned and operated grocery stores. So globally, we have about 7,500 rooftops, and here in the US, 2,200 stores for IGA.
Awesome. We'll make sure we get you out on time on this Friday. You know, one of the things I noticed in your background, you've worked at some pretty iconic consumer loved brands. You and I were just talking about that earlier. How do you think about translating that big brand thinking into IGA's bit of a decentralized, independent retail model?
Great question. So, well, I'll start by saying, a brand is a brand. So I think it's important to understand what's core about a brand and what's important. But that being said, at Coca-Cola, where I spent almost 17 years, there was a mantra about think global, act local. And then when I left Coke and went over to Gannett and USA Today, they owned USA Today. They owned 100 plus local newspapers, 30 plus local TV stations. I think what that tells you from some of those large, big companies, the value of local is critical. And so what we do today is help local independent store owners figure out the best way to connect on a community basis. And if you think about the larger chains out there, we won't mention some of the publicly traded company names, but they try as much as possible, take that global and make it local. And by definition and by nature, our brands are local. And so they're embedded in the community. Some of the store owners are mayors of their local town, or they own the shopping center, or they're the first person that folks turn to when there's a need in the community or a sponsorship opportunity. So the fact that we have that local community, it's almost like the opposite of some of those big brands of, how do you take that local, how do you take that community, how do you take the place where people want to shop and turn that into a larger macro brand? And so, that's what we've done in terms of creating an overarching brand, because each of those stores, as I mentioned, is independently owned and operated. I like to say, we make suggestions, they make decisions. And, one of our old CMOs at Coke talked to me about a global position at one time and said, Michael, you'll be most successful in this role, not when you're calling a local market up and saying, hey, why aren't you doing this? You'll be successful when when they call you up and say, hey, I want in. And so, our goal from a brand standpoint, from a program standpoint, is to create scalable, customizable, compelling offerings so that those local markets, those local stores want to be a part of it and do it in a way that's coherent and connected so that that brand doesn't get lost along the way.
No, I love that. I think your quote there, you mentioned I had one similar in my career. It was global scale with local applicability, and I think I picked that up during my time at Newell Brands. Very similar, probably to some of your time you've had in your prior career and also in the current. That makes a ton of sense. I think as you are competing against these local players, or against rather these much larger players, how do you differentiate? And it seems like you have a very clear path that I'm sure your time earlier in your career was very helpful to think about this. And they're lucky to have someone like you on board. I would just say that, Michael.
Shucks. Thank you.
Hey, I wanted to ask you, how has your direct marketing mindset influence the way IGA approaches things such as shopper insights, whether it be loyalty programs and CRM in today's pretty fragmented retail environment?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's to some extent a funny question because I don't know that people call it direct marketing anymore. So I started my career prior to Coke at a direct marketing advertising agency. And right now it's really only important in my career because it really colors my take on marketing. And so perhaps had I gone to work at perhaps the world's most recognizable brand first, I would have a different take on marketing. But I learned at a very early age, marketing has to drive action. And right, I think today everyone looks at it, you hear about, ROI and incremental ROI and what's the return on my marketing spend? When I started my career, I'm going to age myself, that conversation didn't always happen. And it should have, but it didn't. And so growing up, if you will, for 4 years at a direct marketing advertising agency where that was like the mantra on a daily basis, the takeaway I had from that experience was that marketing must drive action. So, right, it could be awareness, but you got to measure that. And so, now working at IGA in terms of grocery store, right? Obviously, we've got to drive trips, we got to drive transactions, we got to make sales. And so, marketing to drive action is super important. So, whether it's insights, whether it's loyalty programs, CRM, all of those have got to, exist for a reason. And so, insights critically important and drives what we do, whether we create, a new program, whether we create a new opportunity for our shoppers. It really starts with that. And, one of the important takeaways from my time at Coke was, kind of a shopper mantra, if you will, or shopper marketing mantra of starting with the shopper, right? So who's the shopper? Secondly, what's important to them? Then how does the brand meet their needs? And finally, where do you activate? And so, I always think about it in that way in terms of, making sure that marketing has to drive action. And it starts with those shopper insights because if you're not focused on the shopper, if you're not focused on the end user, you're going to sort of get in your own head, get in your own way and start, thinking about marketing about yourself versus marketing about the shopper.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think it would have been great to have. I spent most of my time in my career on the more of the commercial side, less on the brand development side, and kind of the stereotypical things that will exist in or large organizations where you typically have your marketing persona and you have your sales persona or commercial persona. And I really love your point about marketing has to drive impact. And I think about that old saying of it's much more about impact than activity. And I think that is kind of the myth buster that we're seeing today in the last probably 5 years of all the things you just mentioned earlier with regards to incremental ROAS or what actually am I generating in return for what I am investing. And I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think the other thing too is, I don't know if you've ever seen this picture. It was popular maybe 5 years ago or something. And not to date yourself, but trust me, based on our haircut, we're probably the same type of age. But with that being said, he talked about user experience and user design. It was a picture of like a college campus and it had a nice path going around. And then that was concrete. And then it actually had the path that everyone was walking on, which was
Right.
not that pretty concrete path. It was just, it was the most convenient. And I think what I often have seen, and it's a watch out for brands, is they want to put themselves at the center of it. And I don't think they do it intentionally, but they talk about their brand and they talk about what that brand means and they talk about, and it's I, and not them, them, them. And if you're in a brand business, it's all about them, them, them. And I think that's one point that I just wanted to kind of countersink to your earlier notion there.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And I may not have seen that cartoon, but I have certainly been on enough college campuses to see the worn paths on the grass versus the concrete. And I think, that mantra that I talked about in terms of who's the shopper, what's important to them, how does your brand best fit? The brand comes, is tertiary in that conversation as opposed to, first and foremost. But the important thing is how does your brand best fit? You have to have a brand, right? You have to have done the work to understand who the brand is. You have to make sure that you do have a powerful and strong brand and told the story in the right way, but it doesn't always come first.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I think keeping the shopper at the center of it all is something that many take their eye off of the proverbial ball, and that's where I've seen things kind of go left or go right.
Yeah,
And
you can't eat your own dog food
yeah,
in
that's
marketing,
right.
right? Of like it's getting
Yeah,
too in love with yourself.
that's right. Awesome. Hey, I wanted to switch gears a little bit here. I want to get your thoughts on storytelling. How do you think about storytelling? What role does that play in building richer relationships with customers across the IGA network of stores? especially when the earlier point we were talking about you're trying to drive both local and national relevance.
Yeah, so I'd say let me talk about local and national relevance first. So I think from a relevant standpoint, local is critical. And so local's the shopper experience. So does the shopper care if IGA has 7,500 stores, 2,200 stores, or 10 stores? Probably not. So that local piece is important. The national relevance becomes important as we talk about scale and having conversations with CPG brands about the value of working with an IGA and what IGA can do to help you. And so there's this chart that I use, a slide that I stole from one of our CPG brand partners that talks about the difficulty of working with independent retailers. If you think about it, you could go store by store by store and reach those 2,200 retailers on your own. You have 2,200 call points. That's complicated, right? You think about that the old staple ad about the easy button. And so, we took a lot of that of like, what's the complicated work of dealing with independents. There's, 30,000 across the US, represents a third of the US, $250 billion. That's a sizable chunk, but if I have to do it onesies, twosies, I'm out, right? That becomes complicated. So that national piece is probably more important on a B2B side versus on a consumer side. So storytelling is important there because, as we talk to brands about opportunities with an IGA, we have to make sure that we're sharing the right opportunity. From a consumer standpoint, it's got to be storytelling built on insights, as we talked about. And so that notion of local community being important, we know the perimeter of the grocery store oftentimes is really the gateway to not just walking in the door, but the brand itself and what that brand represents to you and kind of that storytelling that you talked about. And so a few years back, we created sort of this brand ethos of local equals fresh. And so the notion of tying that store into the local community, knowing that people prefer many times, local food purveyors, local food providers, local farms. So we've tied into that ethos because, that's as much as we can, we try and bring local to the forefront and local products and local services. Now, that's not everything, and we can't always do that, but it's important that we kind of tie those two together. And so freshness, local are key drivers of shoppability, key drivers of, trips. And so telling that story and making sure that it's relevant to shoppers is critically important. So, overall, storytelling super important both on the consumer and shopper side as well as on the manufacturer side.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the sense of community that comes from what you just talked about is really, really an important differentiator in my opinion. And this is not, you haven't told me to say this is my personal opinion of so many individuals as well. They want to contribute to local community, local, shops and stores, no matter what the shop or store, but that supports the community and supports local. And so I could certainly see you all are doing quite a good job at the storytelling aspect of this. I think it is a bit of a miss I've seen on some of the chains out there where it kind of doesn't actually hit the mark. I think you all do a very nice job of kind of that kind of dance of art and art and science, if you will. So, well, hey, I wanted to get your take on ton of so much focus on digital innovation and shopper experience going on currently, especially with AI and all these different things that have occurred in the last 12 plus months. How are you at IGA evolving the in-store programs to align with the online expectations and behaviors of consumers?
Great question, especially from the guy whose middle name is e-commerce, right? So, a high percentage of sales are digitally influenced. So I've seen 50%, I've seen 70%, even some folks who say 100% of sales are digitally influenced in some form or fashion. So I'm not going to argue with any of those numbers. I'd say a high percentage of sales. Yet most sales, especially in grocery, still happen in store. And so the way we think about it is there's some key points along that mythical shopper journey that need to be taken into account. So the point of inspiration, right? So what gets me thinking about why I need to go to the grocery store. So it could be, hey, July 4th is coming up, we're going to have a party. That sort of makes me think about it. That point of decision. Okay, where am I going to go buy where's that shopping trip going to happen? Where's that, what's that product? How am I going to buy that? And then the point of transaction. In today's digital age, sometimes those happen in a second, right? I need to go buy, recently we had an issue with a hot water filter. I needed to get a hot water filter replacement. It all happened at one time and literally it showed up the next day because I had the issue. I was inspired. I made a decision about, well, I need this. I don't care. And that transaction happened all in one time. Sometimes those take days, weeks, months. And so most grocery stores, not months, but so it's important to cater to the shopper, as we said. It's important that we know that they're digitally influenced, and so to make sure that we're connecting along those points of inspiration, the points of decision, the points of transaction with things that are going to entice them to shop. And so one of the things we did to create this kind of a virtual network across IGA 8 years ago was actually we created what we call our national digital ad, which in today's world is called like retail media, right? We created it to connect our network of stores because not all stores fly the IGA banner, but they're all independent and pull some level of services or marketing from us. And so it created a national construct for us to connect with shoppers that we know are digitally influenced and that we know they're that quote unquote pre-shop behavior for that inspiration. And so we leaned into that and created something that works very well for our stores to drive trips and transactions, whether that's in store or online. And it works really well in terms of driving efficiency for manufacturing partners to reach across those, all of our rooftops with digital messages that are going to resonate with the shopper. And then in store, we don't just have one platform, we have multiple platforms just given the independent nature of things, leaning into loyalty programs, leaning into, different technologies. We have actually IGA Geisler's up in Connecticut was the first store to roll out Instacart's Caper Carts fully. And so, you're able to shop and throw things in your cart and log into your account all at one time and just walk out of the store. And so, we have all sorts of retailers within our network, but the majority of stores are very focused on that shopper. How do we best meet their needs, whether that's, something, I guess, digitally or whether that's something that's just going to make that shopping experience a little bit more special and a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think because the expectations certainly have elevated in the last, 10 years, certainly in the last probably 2 years. And having that, as seamless as you can experience is critical. So I wanted to ask you last question here, and again, we'll make sure you get out on time. But from your experience, what's the most overlooked opportunity for brand and shopper marketing leaders looking to create more profitable customer relationships in today's CPG retail ecosystem?
That's kind of a softball, right? And I am wearing my IGA
You do have
garb.
your
So
yeah, you have the vest
yeah,
on, yeah.
yeah. So I'm a big fan of behavioral science. And one of the things I've learned is that it's human nature to be lazy. And if you think about that, from a cognitive standpoint, a lot of our energy goes into our brain and, all the nutrients and stuff like that get sucked up in the brain. And so we've been programmed to not always have to think, not always have to, have our brains on 100% of the time because there's no way we could consume all those calories. So long story short, but if it's human nature to be easy, right? We want to find the shortest path to to do whatever we're doing, whether that's barbecuing for July 4th, as I talked about, or shopping or marketing into the retail and CPG space. So I think independents, because of the nature of their business, their independence, decisions don't get made centrally, stuff like that. They're kind of difficult to work with. And so what we've done within the network to create kind of that easy button, as I said, and I said earlier, there's a third of the U.S. grocery is independence. There's $255 billion there. And I think, an overlooked, not intentional discrimination, but I think unintentional is building the business with independence. And it's might be arguably a little bit more complicated, but it's important to build the business in a way, that, this is an opportunity to make sure that you're looking for, looking for untapped opportunities and looking for, in many cases, higher margin opportunities. And so, we've created a partnership program where we're very focused on creating that triple win. So shoppers win and benefit because we're bringing in attention and investment from CPGs that retailers wouldn't otherwise get. So shoppers win, retailers win, and brands win because, we are very easy to work with and are creating a lot of programs that are easy to plug into and can provide incremental value because, as much attention hasn't been spent with independence. And so when that happens, when attention does get spent, they get oversized rewards typically. So I think a focus on, kind of if you think about high growth potential, high margin opportunity, that's where independence and that's where IGA sit. And I think a lot of brands are very focused against, well, if I make just one call at a large national retailer, all's good. Or if I just go through the online and their retail media or so on and so forth, I've covered everything, but that's not the market. That's not all the shoppers. That's not all the opportunities that are available. So I think short answer to your question of like, what's the greatest opportunity? Open your eyes to the bigger universe of what's available in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think you're spot on when you think about, I mean, a couple of points you made there, which resonate with me is there's a very interesting TAM, so a total addressable market. It is in many ways, highly fragmented, and you all provide a degree of simplification. And to use your words earlier, and, like in my own phrasing is, it feels to me like IGA could be an easy button for brands looking to provide address a market that perhaps is, to use all the corporate, buzzwords that we all probably have learned over the last 20 something years, low hanging fruit, and feels like you all have the right systems and structure in place that would make it very interesting for a CPG brand to have a phone call, understand what is offered, and really address a market that would probably be rather difficult to try to address otherwise, but it feels like you all provide a very easy way to address that very attractive and profitable market.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly try to, and the fact that all these stores are independently owned and operated, kind of our take and our partnership philosophy with brands is that, they're investing behind these opportunities because they see category growth opportunities, they see shopper insights, et cetera. And if we can help them bring those to bear at our retailers and help through retailer education and shopper engagement, and we create more sales for the brands, we're creating more sales for the retailers, and so everyone wins. And I think, I appreciate the kind words, but as I mentioned, 2,200 stores here in the US, there's 20,000 independents. So, we're just scratching the surface of what's possible. And, we think that there's a lot more opportunity out there. So while we've, basically doubled the number of stores in our network over the past 4 or 5 years, there's a lot more work to do.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time today, joining and sharing a little bit with the audience about IGA, sharing a little bit about your background. And I guess in closing, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with today?
No, I think that the opportunities there, as we mentioned, but I think the important piece is making sure that you're thinking about it right. As you said, there's untapped opportunity. There's opportunity to look at things in a different way. And, again, if we can be successful for CPG brands and our retailers, that we've done our job. The interesting thing about IGA is that given just our ownership structure owned by wholesalers and retailers, we operate as a not-for-profit. And what that means is we're typically a very efficient marketing partner to reach a part of the market that doesn't often get reached. And so if you can do that without sort of the high price ticket, if you will, that typically comes with retail, it sets up an interesting opportunity for brands to talk to us.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation.
Likewise.
Welcome to this week's episode of the CPG View, the #1 CPG information source for global omnichannel leaders.